You know, I
Okay.
love our gender balance, by the way.
South Korea should do more of this,
Yes,
which we should probably say.
yes. Especially in the light of, what Sarah will probably be talking about. I think we are doing really great.
Yeah, I think the last
Exactly.
panel I was on South Korea, I was the only woman there, and I also spoke about gender, and I think it made a lot of men there uncomfortable.
Right.
Well, that's our job, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to introduce all four of you, but I was thinking, like, I don't have a special order. I was thinking either to follow the order that we have on the poster, or have Chien-Hao maybe, not leave him last, but maybe put him in somewhere in the middle as I present you all. I don't know if you guys have a preference, so I would go with Jeongmin and Sarah, well, then Tereza, and then, okay, Chien-Hao. Or do you think I should follow a different order? This is at the beginning when I present you.
I'm quite happy to go last, but as you like.
Can I actually go not first, because I want to feel the room a little bit on which policies I should focus on, because my topic's quite broad.
You mean when we start this is just for the introductions. When we start the actual webinar, like, you don't want to go first?
I would prefer not to, but I'm fine either way, actually.
Okay, I was just thinking it's best if we have you, because you're on the ground and you can touch upon the domestic and international afterwards. But I can also start with Chien-Hao. I can start with him, and then you could follow up, and then Sarah, and then Tereza. Is that okay?
Yeah, both sounds good to me. Let's just see when he will be joining us. Yeah, I don't mind. Let's just go with me first, actually.
Okay.
Because I was just wondering how much I should explain about the gender policy, but probably that's
okay.
I'll just leave it to Sarah.
Okay, so we'll start with you. Well, it's 4 o'clock, so I think we should get ready to start. We're still waiting for our fourth panelist. Hopefully he'll join us any minute. So if anyone has already joined us from the audience, welcome. Just taking a minute here to complete our panel. So please bear with us for a minute. Okay. I think we will start, and maybe then Mr. Yang can join us as we start, since we only have 1 hour and we have lots to discuss. So I suggest that we wait 1 more minute, and apologies for that, but I think it's worth waiting just to make sure that the panel is complete, and then we can start the exchange. So just 1 minute, please. Okay, so well, I suggest that we slowly start, and I'll make the introductions so that we're not losing too much time, since we have only 1 hour, and then we'll let Mr. Yang join us as we proceed. So Good morning and good afternoon or good evening to all of you joining us today at our webinar, Yoon's upcoming presidency in South Korea, domestic and international implications, a webinar co-hosted by 9-Line, Taiwan NextGen, and the Freie Universität Berlin. My name is 𝕊𝕥𝕣𝕖𝕒 and I will moderate today's discussion. I am the head of the Associates Network at 9-Line and non-resident fellow at Taiwan NextGen, currently based in Taipei. So for those of you not yet familiar with us, 9-Line is an independent platform offering analysis seeking to connect Europe and the Indo-Pacific, stimulating nuanced dialogue through engagement with partners from all sectors. Taiwan NextGen is a think tank and education foundation working to make Taiwan more sustainable, diverse, and inclusive, focusing on Taiwan's soft power, New Southbound Policy, and the Bilingual Nation 2030 plan. And of course, we're very happy to cooperate with the Freie Universität Berlin today for this occasion. So our aim today is to look at the presidential elections that took place in South Korea on March 9th and look beyond the elections. So former prosecutor and conservative Yoon Suk-yeol of People Power Party was elected South Korea's new president, defeating his liberal rival Lee Jae-myung. He vowed national unity and promised to work with opposition parties to make Korea a proud, responsible member of the international community and the free world, an election result he called a victory of the great people. Now, we invited a panel of experts to look at both the domestic implications of these elections, including gender politics that played a very important role in the process, and the international implications. So as a think tank based in Taiwan, we at NextGen, we consider that Taiwan should participate in these debates, should be part of these conversations, given that Taiwan's future in the region and globally is closely linked to that of its regional partners, including South Korea, in particular as China continues to increase its role in the region. At 9-Line, we also see great value in exploring the EU's role in the Indo-Pacific. With the recent regional dynamics and most recently with Putin's war against Ukraine, EU foreign policy is going through an important transition, to some unexpected, to others a long overdue change. But I think it's very interesting and important for us to also include Europe in this conversation. So with this background in mind, I am pleased to welcome our speakers. And I would like to start with Ms. Jeongmin Kim. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Jeongmin is the lead correspondent at NK News and NK Pro, based in Seoul. She covers inter-Korean DPRK-related foreign affairs, defense and humanitarian development. As a press corps member of the National Assembly, Democratic Party, and People Power Party, Jeongmin has closely followed the 2022 presidential election news on the ground. And prior to joining NK News, she worked for Reuters Seoul Bureau and the CSIS Korea Chair in Washington, D.C. And her writings on both Korea policy, Asian society, and the national interest, and more. Thanks for joining us. Now I'd like to move to Dr. Sarah Liu, lecturer in gender and politics at the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. Her research focuses on cross-national comparison of gender and politics with a special focus on Asia. Her works have appeared widely in peer-reviewed academic journals as well as media outlets, including the Washington Post, Monkey Cage, and The Conversation UK. Thanks for joining us as well. And then I would like to move on to Dr. Tereza Novotná. Tereza is the Korea Associate at 9-Line and Korea-Europe Center Fellow at Freie Universität Berlin, where she previously held a Marie Curie research project on the EU's foreign policy towards North Korea. She's also Senior Associate Research Fellow at 𝕃𝕚𝕧𝕖, which is a Prague-based think tank. And she's also author of the monograph, How Germany Unified and the EU Enlarged, Negotiating the Accession Through Transplantation and Adaptation, and has widely published on EU foreign policy. And so I'm very grateful that you all joined us today. We also have Mr. Yang Chien-Hao, who we plan to have on the panel. So we're waiting for him to join us, and I'm sure he will join us any minute. But I suggest that before he does, or as we're waiting for him to join us, that we go ahead and make the best of our time. So before we proceed, I would just like to make an announcement that we're taking questions from the audience. So I invite you to start sending in your questions or drop them in our live stream on Facebook or YouTube pages. Now, I prepared some preliminary questions just to start a conversation. I think most value lies in letting you exchange and with my moderation to the best of my ability. So I would like to start with you, Jeongmin, if I may. And I was thinking to ask you that you followed closely the elections on the ground, and it would be interesting to hear from you how you would assess the outcome domestically and both internationally. So domestically, of course, there's lots of challenges that the country is facing. Youth unemployment, growing house prices, a surging COVID infection, and I'm only mentioning a few here. But internationally, Korea sits in a region where China has been increasing its presence and influence. And this is something that has pulled democratic countries and partners closer together. So I am wondering if you see a change in administration to shape Korea's role in the region and its international standing and also its influence, keeping in mind the importance of its cooperation and relations with the US, the China factor, and of course, North Korea. So if you could address some of these issues, of course, it's a lot to unpack there, but to start the conversation, you have maybe about 4, 5, 6 minutes. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the very generous introduction, and thank you for having me today. That's a very wide range of topics, and I could go on for an hour with these topics, honestly. But just to start with the domestic consequences of the election, just very briefly, I would like to first mention that domestically, Yoon faces big challenges ahead in terms of unity of the country, how harmonious the society could be under Yoon. Yoon won with a very slight margin compared to the rival Lee Jae-myung, and right after the exit poll, the exit polls one exit poll actually suggested that Lee may win. So and after the win with a very slight margin, now even before Yoon is heading into office, recent polls suggest that the disapproval rate is higher than the approval rate. So along with this, as well as how in the parliament and the National Assembly, the majority is still for the Democratic Party. So domestically, he has a lot of constraints. There are a lot of sensitive issues, agendas that he has to handle. The gender divide, feminism, anti-feminism, which both campaigns used during the election trail quite a lot, that received international criticism. And also there are economic issues that you raised, such as the real estate policies that a lot of people here see as one of the biggest failures of the Moon administration. And Yoon, during the campaign trail, vowed to resolve the issue. But many of the agendas that Yoon has to deal with do require some consensus and help from the parliamentary consensus as well. But at least until 2024, when there is a parliamentary election, I'm not sure if Yoon has much bandwidth to institutionally change what he sees as a failure of the Moon administration. And during the election campaign trail, much of the Yoon team's main slogan, really, in approaching domestic issues was basically anti-Moon administration. Yoon symbolically stood for someone who was actually hired by the Moon administration to handle the impeachment of the former president Park Geun-hye, which President Moon released from prison recently. And Yoon initially was this image of someone who impeached the previous president. But after some domestic scandals and power struggles between Moon administration and aides, he became the leading face of the conservative People Power Party in the election. So the general setting, even before the election, was that there is this wide gap of the trust issue between the two sides of the country, the majority parties. So I'm just going to end there on domestic issues, that he just has a mounting challenge in how to seek consensus in this really very much divided society. On international issues, you mentioned US, China, and North Korea, and I should include Japan as well, probably. During one of the official presidential debates before the election, when Yoon was asked who he will meet first when he becomes president, he answered in this order: United States, Japan, China, and North Korea. This is in comparison with previous liberal government and other presidential candidates as well, which actually gave North Korea, inter-Korean relations, a higher priority. And he also differs with others from how he treats Japan. Japan, of course, has a very deep-rooted historical issues with South Korea that's not resolved. And Yoon himself as well officially is going to go with a two-track approach, where he is going to hold Japan accountable for historical issues, but seek better cooperation when it comes to security issues. But there could be backlash from his push for closer ties with Japan. But that's a good news for the United States, because the United States has been working very hard to make Japan and South Korea to tread closer, so that the three could work as a triad deterrence power against the regional superpower China as well. And when it comes to United States-South Korea relations, although Yoon during the campaign trail has said multiple times that the US-RK alliance faltered during the Moon administration, I'm not sure if that is a fair interpretation of what actually happened. And looking closely at his policy pledges, it seems that he is going to follow through on many of the things that Moon administration actually agreed with the Biden administration, especially during the May summit last year. And what Yoon has been saying, though, importantly, is that he puts more value on more weight on this democratic value that the countries like US and South Korea shares, which could be an important signal for China and, of course, North Korea. During the campaign trail, Yoon was, to me, it seemed that he was being cautious not to say directly that South Korea and US will be deterring China together. But he was mentioning the issue of growing power of China many times, and that Yoon will aim for a principled diplomacy where he will voice against things such as human rights infringement. There he didn't mention China and only mentioned North Korea, but I believe that issue, if Biden and Yoon agrees on putting out a joint statement, something like that, I think we can imagine that could come out in comparison to the Moon administration. Yoon has been seeing Moon as doing something called 3 no's policy on China. And that refers to how, part of it refers to how, about THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, how South Korea has been too cautious around China and tiptoeing around, so that South Korea basically gave up deploying more batteries, is Yoon's argument, although Moon administration believes that because of domestic systems such as LSAM, it's not necessary, and expecting China's economic retaliation, that is not for national benefit. But Yoon, it seems, is less cautious about such consequences, it seems. And Yoon has been openly pledging that he will be aiming at issues such as THAAD. And when it comes to trilateral cooperation with Japan and China, Yoon has been also less cautious in saying that although he said that he is not seeking a military trilateral alliance right away, he said that he wouldn't take that off the table just for China's sake. So all in all, Yoon has been much more vocal against maintaining something called strategic ambiguity between China and the United States. But Yoon's foreign policy vision nonetheless states that South Korea aims to become a pivotal state in Northeast Asia with some leverages it has as a middle power. Yoon aims to use it to not sitting on the fence, but keeping close ties with the United States, but also seeking a constructive partnership with China. So it remains to be seen what kind of actual policies that Yoon will actually go for after he inaugurates in May 10th. And just quickly on inter-Korean issues, Yoon has been also not Yoon has not been using languages that Yoon has been using languages that Moon administration has been cautious to use, such as provocation against North Korea's missile testing. And Yoon's view of Moon administration was that there's this phrase that Yoon often used, subservient behavior against North Korea. It's Yoon's view that Moon administration has been using too much of a conciliatory appeasement policy and rewarding bad behaviors from North Korea's end. So Yoon, when it comes to denuclearizing North Korea, he is similar to what we usually see as hardliners in international relations theory, such as using sanctions pressure to make North Korea believe that it's time that it is for its own security to denuclearize. But looking at recent developments, it seems that there's also a mounting challenge in front of Yoon, seeing that North Korea already broke the moratorium testing ICBM, and there are signs that they are maybe aiming at additional nuclear tests as well. I'll wrap up here, but these are a lot of topics that we have to consider. If there are any questions, I will take it after other panelists' remarks.
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed, you did cover a lot. I was taking notes, highlighting some of the keywords in terms of unity and question of trust, as well as less cautious, more vocal on certain issues. So definitely there's a lot to unpack there. Thank you for covering both a little bit the domestic scene as well as the international climate and what we can expect. So I think now it's a good moment to turn back a little bit maybe to the domestic issues. And I would like to turn to Sarah now and let you elaborate for us on the gender politics factor in this election. So feminism has been a divisive issue in the country this is not a new development. From what we can read by analysts and what we can watch in the news is that often the Me Too movement has led to a reaction of me first from young men who would disapprove of the direction that the Me Too movement would take in South Korea. And also a survey that I came across shows that 79% of young men in South Korea feel that they are seriously discriminated against. So keeping this in mind, this climate, Yoon declared that there is no systemic gender discrimination in the country, but statistics don't support that. There is a huge pay gap as well, which is one of the most serious in the region. So tackling discrimination on one hand and reconciling the demands of men versus women or men and women, depending on how we look at it, and also supporting the fight for equality. How do you see Yoon being able to navigate all these challenges? So if you could speak to that, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noel, for this question. If it's okay, I would like to address how South Korea got to this point before I address some of the challenges that the current administration or the future administration might have to navigate. But before I do all of that, I want to thank you all for investing your time with us today. And I want to particularly thank the conveners and NextGen Taiwan, 9-Line, and Freie University of Berlin's Korean Studies for making today's webinar happen. It's an absolute honor and privilege for me to be today. So I will take a gender approach to answer that question. We know that South Korea has modernized in many ways. At the same time, South Korea also lags behind its neighbors in gender development. For example, the Global Gender Gap Report identifies South Korea as one of the most dangerous countries for women, just behind India, which was once ranked the most dangerous country for women in the world. And despite these challenges in the gender development, South Korea has actually made many progressive changes in the last few years, particularly with the rise of its Me Too movement. Following the 2018 Me Too movement, a survey by the Korea Research Institute in 2019 indicated that the majority of South Koreans approved of the Me Too movement and saw it benefiting South Korean society as a whole. And a study conducted by the Korean Women's Development Institute in 2018 also showed that 1 in 2 women in their 20s in South Korea identify as feminist. So these movements have begun to challenge long-existing patriarchal practices and customs in South Korea. And while this all seems very promising, the rise of the Me Too movement has also challenged the gender status quo. Many young men regard women's advancement as a threat to their financial security amid a bleak job market and rising living costs. Surveys have shown that young men believe that they are victims of gender discrimination, fueling a gender divide that has been exploited by politicians. And South Korea has thus witnessed an anti-feminist backlash in the last few years, and particularly, and it has particularly appeared in this election, which aided in the victory of the People Power Party, the PPP's Yoon Suk-yeol. And this backlash could certainly be traced back to 2017, when the former president, Moon Jae-in, campaigned on the promise of becoming a feminist president, promoting gender equality policies. And such efforts to alleviate gender inequity gained greater attention following South Korea's own Me Too movement in 2018, which emphasized women's lived experiences, such as dealing with spy camps and increasing occurrences of feminicide. However, Yoon has claimed that he doesn't believe that systematic sexism exists in South Korea. He has blamed the country's low birth rate on feminism. He has called for the abolishment of gender equality ministry, which he says focuses too much on women's rights and is no longer necessary. He has promised to enhance punishments for false accusations of sexual violence, a step that will only deter even more women from coming forward. As a result, we see Yoon receiving overwhelming support from men, particularly men in their 30s and 60s and older, who are anti-feminism, while Democratic Party's Lee Jae-myung received overwhelming support from women. And while this election was a pivotal moment in terms of how women's issues are talked about in public discourse, but what does this mean? Does this mean that South Korea is doomed? Well, first of all, we need to realize that Yoon was elected by a very fine margin. Although he called his win a victory of the great South Korean people, but the result was one of the closest in history, with a final count separated by less than 1%. And Lee gained more support from those in their 20s, 40s, and 50s, and while Yoon in their 30s and 60s and older. So again, what does this mean? This, I think, may mean 2 major things. First, this means that it is a particular set of group of men that support Yoon, the older generations and those in their 30s. So not necessarily the super young ones, right? Meaning that misogyny in South Korea is recognized as a serious problem by the younger generations. And second, even if women were not engaged in this election, they will be in the future, and they will be the future. So what are some of the internal challenges that the administration is going to face? Well, first of all, we see that Korean society is very divided. It's very unequal and polarized. And I'm a little bit concerned about how this discrimination, particularly on Yoon's side and his supporters, will be resolved under his leadership. And Yoon's call to abolish the gender equality ministry, I think it was just an election strategy based on distorted misinformation. So whether or not he's going to realize importance when he becomes president, whether or not he's really going to abolish the gender equality ministry remains a question. However, how he goes or how he proceeds with his platform promise could indicate the kind of directions he wants for South Korean people. And lastly, I think one of the last internal challenges or main internal challenges is that if Yoon follows through on this pledge, it is unclear whether it will be accepted by the country's parliament, right? Because right now, South Korean parliament has an opposition Democratic Party as a majority. So some people predict that his policy of abolishment may become more of a reorganization rather than the actual abolishment. So again, if he doesn't follow up on his platform, what does it mean for the men supporters who support him, right? So the election of Yoon could serve as a wake-up call, I believe, for many who think that there is still, for many, to see that there is still a lot of work to do to achieve gender justice. And this election will motivate people to work harder than before. As presidents in South Korea are limited to a single 5-year term, I believe that South Korea will write a new history of women's politicization, because I know that women will work hard for the next 5 years to combat gender discrimination in South Korea. And recent developments have already illustrated that feminism can be an empowerment tool for young South Korean women to stand in solidarity with one another in fighting misogyny. So such power among the young generations is also not to be ignored, as they have and will continue to transform South Korea, as evidenced by various feminist movements throughout history, whether in South Korea or abroad. So I'm going to answer that question. I think I've answered that question at no post, but I'm also going to end on that hopeful note. And I welcome any questions during Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's indeed a very complex and complicated picture, and I'm glad that you went a bit back in time to highlight the dynamics that brought us here. And yeah, it just I'm glad you end on a hopeful note. But indeed, to me, it's almost another question to ask is, you know, how do we actually reconcile women and men, almost as simple as that? You know, we're using big terms and policies, but I think there's that division in society is very difficult. That is gender, but also generation dimension to it. So thank you so much for your remarks. And well, I'm happy to welcome our fourth panelist. Thank you for joining us. You can hear us, Mr. Yang? Oh, we can't hear you. Sorry, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. So, okay. Well, maybe since time is running out, maybe you could figure that out. Maybe you need to log back in, if that's okay. Just okay. And then what I will do in the meantime, maybe we just, until we get you back, we will move on to Tereza. So that gives you some time to log back. So let's move on then a bit out of the region and connecting Korea and the debate with Europe. So I'm very glad that Tereza, you're with us. And so what I was thinking in terms of bringing you in this conversation, well, we see that there is growing awareness and willingness inside the EU to take a more prominent role in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific. For long, this has been, in terms of foreign policy on the European level, it's been just really work in progress, not much effectiveness to it. But things are changing, especially with a war happening, unfortunately, in the heart of Europe. This is, I think, pushing member states closer together to act and go beyond the rhetoric. So seen from Berlin and Europe more broadly, how do you see this current situation in South Korea and the elections impacting the future of EU-Korea in the larger geopolitical context? So if you could speak to that in the next 5-6 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you, Zsuzsa, so much for such a nice introduction. And also, thank you everyone for coming here, because this is also first event that I'm doing as a 9-Line Korea associate, but also first event in collaboration with my home institution, Freie Universität of Berlin. So it's really great that we can do such a cooperative event. I will a little bit tag on what Jeongmin and Sarah was talking about, because when it comes to European policies, they sort of towards South Korea, they sort of align with what the two speakers have said before. Indeed, Europe-South Korea relations are in a very good shape, and South Korea is considered by the European Union as one of the key like-minded partners in Asia. And I do not expect that this would change greatly under Yoon's presidency. I think this will all continue along the good lines. There might be some changes, and I'll just mention a few. As much as we can see in Europe, a little bit of more alignment with the United States when it comes to relations with China. I think under Yoon's presidency, as Jeongmin quite nicely explained, we can also see a little bit of realignment with the US, along the US vis-a-vis China. So in a sense, that's gonna bring both US and South Korea a bit closer, and also US and Europe, and the triangle between those countries too. The second issue, which has been mentioned already, is the relationship with Japan. If we really see some improvement of the bilateral relationship between South Korea and Japan, that will be only very much welcomed by the European Union. From the European side, both South Korea but also Japan have been strategic partners for a long time, and it has always been quite difficult for the Europeans to, to understand why two democratic countries, big players in Asia, are on such bad terms with one another. So if there is any improvement in the bilateral Japan-South Korea relationship, it will be only welcomed by the Europeans, and it will also make it a little bit easier for the Europeans to pursue policies in Asia, so that if the Europeans do something with South Korea, then they immediately have to look what the impact it will have on Japan relationship, and vice versa. So if this improves, that's going to be only welcome. For Europeans also, there will be some issues regarding sectoral policies. So Europe will certainly look at trade relationship, which has been very good with South Korea, and it seems that President Yoon will continue in that, if not want to deepen it. So that's going to be welcome. Another big issue is climate change. South Korea has been a very good partner on climate change issues. So if that continues, that will be another good sign. And I haven't seen too many controversial statements on that from Yoon's camp. So hopefully that's going to continue. And also health policies. So primarily fighting still COVID-19 and possibly preventing future pandemics, where it seems that despite the fact that South Korea is currently undergoing, probably the worst wave it has had, it has vowed to be a sort of vaccine production hub. And if this continues, that's going to be quite welcome by the Europeans. Now I will move a little bit to the issues that may cause some tensions in the relationship. Probably the biggest question is going to be how South Korea will continue its policies towards the Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and how it will pursue currently the sanctions policies which are pursued by Europe, but also United States, because although South Korea and Moon's administration has joined the sanctions, it has been a bit hesitant to do so. And that was a bit difficult for the Europeans to even understand why, given South Korea's history of war on its peninsula and invasion and so on. So, and there have been also some bit controversial statements during the election campaign on the war in Ukraine. So let's see that, or let's hope that this was just more a question of the election and sort of domestic appeals, and also the question that no one really sort of knew how things will go, and now South Korea will sort of keep aligning itself with the European sanctions on Russia, and possibly if there will be other movements. The second policy, which I think may be slightly difficult, it may actually turn out to be North Korea. It's true that the Europeans have been more on the side of trying to sanction the DPRK and sort of push DPRK to denuclearize through the sanctions, and also through the trying to make them talk to the Americans. But if we also think back at the beginning of Trump's presidency, where Trump was quite gung-ho at North Korea and was threatening with preventing strikes on North Korea, at that time the Europeans were like, oh, slow down. That's not the way we should do it. So if we see that President Yoon will be a little bit too pushy, this may make Europeans to move more on the conciliatory side of things. But again, let's see. It's a bit difficult to judge at the moment what the actual steps will be. And maybe the last point I would like to raise, and that goes back a bit more towards the domestic policies, and the question of what Sarah so eloquently explained, and that's, for instance, the gender issues. Gender balance or feminism, gender issues are very important for Europe. I mean, the European Commission is currently led by a woman for the first time in history, and she has vowed to put gender equality up front to the center. So this suddenly may become a diverging problem for Europeans and South Koreans. And also, I would say, some probably more sort of populist appeals or populist lines that may come from the Blue House, or possibly not even Blue House anymore, given the fact President Yoon wants to relocate his office from Blue House to former defense ministry. So if there will be some bit more populist appeals, slogans, that may actually cause more of a rift between the Europeans and South Koreans, let's say at the value-based, the emotional side of things. But in general, I think the relationship should probably flourish and continue to flourish under the next presidential office. So I think I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you so much for walking us through the positives and also the areas that we can expect to see more tension. Very complicated also in terms of addressing the gender issues. I agree with you that might be even more prominent in the bilateral relations. So thank you for your thoughts. And now I'm happy to welcome our fourth panelist, Mr. Yang Chien-Hao, who is a Taiwanese freelance correspondent with his individual news brand, Core News, providing Korean news coverage to the Taiwanese public broadcasters, several of these. And before covering for Taiwanese media, he worked at BBC World Service as a Seoul correspondent, and he has covered South Korean presidential elections 3 times since 2012, has a long-term expertise observing Korean politics. So thank you for joining us. And because we are quite tight with our time, I would immediately just keep the floor for another minute just to address some of the questions that we've had prepared for you to contribute to and build on the previous presentations. So you have covered Korean politics, and we know that Taiwan's international profile has increased, in particular since the pandemic, just as China's posture in the region has concerned more and more countries. So the China factor, which was already touched upon by the previous speakers in different ways, this has pushed Taiwan closer to Australia, Japan, and to some extent India, but Korea hasn't really been a part of this group of countries embracing Taiwan more gradually. And actually being in Taiwan, this is something I've also noticed from my conversations here. So I would be interested whether you think that with these elections, do you see any positive change possibly, or given the new geopolitical landscape, and as China doubles down on efforts to further isolate Taiwan, do you see that Korea and Taiwan could get closer?
All right, thank you. Sorry for being late because there's an engineer coming to my apartment and he cut down the internet. Which made me delay for like 15 or 20 minutes. I was so shocked for that. I might deeply apologize for that.
No problem.
First, I would like to share my experience of dealing with like mainstream television channels when covering the presidential election and doing the live broadcast for them this time. And as my experience and monitoring the TV news and articles and the YouTubers and influencers in Taiwan, you can see most of the channels are only focusing on the candidate's position and attitude toward China, even framing that Yoon is being elected because South Korean people hate China and because Yoon is in the stance of anti-China more clearer than Lee Jae-myung. And my clients, like TV stations, they are asking me to talk more about it, and I was a bit angry for that, and I had some arguments. And also some journalists in Taiwan for covering for international news in other channels have revealed that they've been asked to produce news in such a frame to get more ratings or traffics. And I've told my clients, and I've also written a column about this, saying that framing the election issue only based on China is such a stupid and ridiculous thing. I've covered the Korean news here for 9 years, and yes, I can indeed sense that people in South Korea, the citizens, the voters here, and they're holding a very negative attitude to China these years. But because of receiving revenging sanctions from China after placing THAAD, and because of seeing Chinese netizens radical and rational comments based on nationalism, and because of claiming that kimchi appeared first in China, and because of the controversial judgment of the short track speed skating in Beijing Winter Olympic Games, that has formed a bad reputation of China in Koreans' minds. But that's not only the variable affecting the voters. During the election campaign, I've done long investigative reports talking about the domestic issues such as real estate problems, growing house price, and the worsening livelihood economy affected by the pandemic, and also the sexual harassments and the conflict of genders. Those are definitely more important variants during this election, definitely more than China and other diplomatic issues. But unfortunately, the mainstream media, especially the news channels and YouTubers in Taiwan, they don't care, and they don't even want to pay attention on it, only thinking that, oh, Taiwan, we're now facing threats from China, and that is the most important part, and South Korea must be the same, and that's all. And if you're holding this kind of position observing Korea, that will be very risky and will cause yourself being misled, because you're placing Koreans only in your position, thinking that anti-China is the only way and everything should be like that. And for me, I'm also an anti-China guy but when observing international affairs, it shouldn't be like that. Domestic affairs play more bigger roles in the election this time. And if you don't want to understand it, then how can you suggest Korean understanding you and pulling them cooperating together? If it is like that, back to Professor Ferenci's question, then how can Koreans and Taiwanese become closer? Indeed, if you look at these 5 years of President Moon's term and the position of the ruling Democratic Party, it is very clear that the current government want to avoid enraging China. Apparently, they are emphasizing the strengthening allies relationship with the United States, but the current government is very inactive, joining anti-China frame leading by the United States, even having no intentions attending Quad or Five Eyes Union, because the current government still regard China as the key role to convince North Korea acting better and to change North Korea in a better way. To me and to many Taiwanese, that's nonsense. But for the liberals here in South Korea, that's still one of their hopes. But frankly speaking, when considering the domestic negative attitude toward China and the current international situation, whether Yoon Suk-yeol or Lee Jae-myung is elected, I think they will both adjust and move to a stance closer to the United States and further from China, just differs from the level. As watching Yoon on TV debate and covering his rally, I've heard of him mentioning Taiwan several times, like for example, praising Taiwan handling the pandemic way more better than Korea, not surrendering to China, and talking about Taiwan's many kinds of experience, which is kind of uncommon for a presidential candidate after the breakdown in 1992. So I would assume that Yoon Suk-yeol cares and pays attention much on Taiwan more than Lee Jae-myung. And if Yoon is really gonna moving more closer to the United States, even joining the anti-China frame, then a common overlap, a space between South Korea and Taiwan will finally appear, and more official interactions or cooperations will be expected to come. But the problem is, I don't think that's gonna come that fast, because still around 25% of Koreans' import and export are still relying on China. It is still quite huge. And it will become risky if Yoon soon says no or becomes more stronger toward China. That's another question which I've always want to ask him. What is the card? What are the cards you can use if you want to stand against China? If Korea want to do that, and if we expect Korea cooperate with Taiwan officially, then the very first challenge of Yoon will be to reduce relying on China economically. Also, if you look back on President Park Geun-hye, who has visited Taiwan, whose father had the best relationship with Taiwan during the period so-called when Taiwan was being called Free China during the 60s and 70s, when she's been elected president in the end of 2012. Many Taiwanese media were also praising and expecting the relationship between Taiwan and South Korea would become closer and better. Indeed, the non-official exchange or interactions had indeed improved a lot during her term. I can totally feel that, like, for example, netizens or citizens in South Korea and Taiwan are understanding each other way more better, and even Koreans often showing their support toward Taiwan, calling Taiwan #1, or saying Taiwan and China are different. But politically and officially, she was being President Park Geun-hye was being regarded as the most pro-Chinese president before placing third. And neither can we see any improvement during President Moon's term, because he cares nothing about Taiwan. So in Chinese, we have a word called 世大主义. In Korean, we say 4大主义. Trimming policy or flunkyism might also happen after Yoon takes the office. Having the strong attitude toward China might just be a way only for him trying to attract the votes by manipulating diplomatic populism instead of really doing it after taking office. So I think we still need to wait and see.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting, and I'm so glad you managed to join us. Sorry that you had that difficulty, but it's good to have you. So we do not have much time, maybe about 10 minutes or 8-10 minutes. So I do have some questions, but I would like to see if any of you want to interact with some of the things that you've heard, because I saw a lot of you nodding at different times. So if there's anything you would like to share in reaction to the things you've heard, please do that now. Okay. And if you could please keep it short, just so we use time best as we can. Thanks.
I just wanted to follow up quickly on what Tereza talked about regarding North Korea policy. Often we see that the election pledges and what the presidents are actually capable of doing largely differs because they are looking at different audience and different goals. North Korea is something exactly like that. During the election period, North Korea is a very useful tool for them to show their charismatic leadership, show their value orientation, and so on and so forth. I think that's why Yoon was very much, his language is about anti-communism, how North Korean leaders should be taught a lesson and things like that. All of things were mentioned. But then actually an evidence to Tereza's point recently, a few days ago, is that Yoon's team said that their North Korea policy wouldn't be quote unquote hardline one. It's quite interesting because all their policies about resuming the three-pillar system, the interceptor system, and how the 2018 military agreement could be rescinded if North Korea continues to break it. All of these things does not really add up when they say that they are not going for a hardline policy. So I just wanted to say that we shouldn't base our prediction of what Yoon is actually going to do in the next few years when it comes to talking to North Korea based on his pledges. We already see some discrepancies, and he is probably already realizing it's a very difficult dilemma that many of the administrations fail to actually solve.
Thanks so much. That's a very good point. Anyone else wants to add something to that, or any other issues that you would like to raise that you didn't have the chance to do while you made your presentations?
I also wanted to echo what Tereza said about the external challenges that Yoon would face, because gender equality is not just a domestic issue, right? And I think when gender equality is a principle and a core value that most democracies are pursuing, right? I do think that if South Korea wants to maintain, like the largest 10 economies in the world and whatnot, it has to comply with the standard principles of gender equality. So I do think that in addition to the internal challenges that Yoon will face under his presidency, he will also have to navigate on how he leads South Korea, particularly in South Korea's relations with not just the EU, right, but also other democracies, and not just Western democracies, other democracies in the region as well. And I think oftentimes South Korea is often compared with, for example, Taiwan, right, where over 40% of the national legislature consists of women. And I do think that is something that will haunt Yoon's presidency if he doesn't address that properly.
Yeah. Yes, maybe if I can just say a few words in reaction. To some extent, I think both what Jeongmin and Sarah just said goes to the fact that to some extent President Yoon is quite unpredictable because we know what the policy program, what the agenda was, but then when we follow his statements even after the elections, the quite controversial things like what I mentioned about moving the presidential office from the historical Blue House to other venues. I think that basically goes back to his personality and the fact that to some extent I think he's or South Korea is to some extent a bit behind in developments in Europe and US, in the sense that it has just elected its maybe not the first, but quite clearly a populist president, right? And that makes it difficult to assess what his campaigning was just to attract the votes and what his actual policies will be. And I think this fact that his personality and the fact that he's not embedded in any of the parties for a long time, that he has come from outside of politics, that may be the hardest thing for both domestic policies, but also for the international partners, who will sort of have to get used to this type of politician in South Korea, rather than someone who's been around for quite a long time, and therefore it's quite clear what his views are.
Right. Okay, thank you so much. Mindful of the time, we really have 3 minutes, so I do want to pick some of the questions. Well, several here that came through, but there's one question that touches upon Korea-Russia relations. I mean, Tereza, you did refer to that briefly, so we have that as a question, and also your views on the prospects for Korea's engagement with Quad, for example, as a Quad Plus member. So if you could, anyone address that in the next 2 minutes, because we will have to wrap up after that. So just be mindful of the time. Anyone, please?
Just 20 seconds maybe.
Okay.
On Quad Plus or Quad, I think a lot of, I think what we are missing out when we are talking about this is also whether or not Quad will want South Korea. Quad itself is going through a very difficult time right now on restraining each other and aligning with each other, especially with the Ukraine crisis. There are different voices in the United Nations Security Council and so on and so forth. And it's a military alliance partnership. And South Korea, although when South Koreans see other military cooperations and alliances, what they see them as is it's just additional, like addition to their power, addition to their arsenal, addition to their friendship. And when Yoon is saying that he wants to join Quad Plus by joining into like less political sectors like climate change, he although he says that it's Quad Plus, I don't think the discussion on whether or not Quad really wants South Korea is voices in the being robustly discussed within the Yoon's team right now, which I just really wanted to point out. And Russia issue, in relations with North Korea issues as well, this is going to be a conflict point in coming years for South Korea, because when it comes to North Korea, with looking at Yoon's pledges, the thing we have to consider is, does sanction work? And looking at the Russia issue, North Korea voted against condemning Russia and China abstained. And looking at this, they are treading very closely, and Yoon basing his policy on sanctions. And if the sanctions regime does not work, he will at some point have to consider where South Korea has to stand vis-a-vis Russia, and it will be a very difficult decision.
Well, thank you so much for addressing those. Unless anyone wants to add another 30-second thought, I think I will have to wrap up. So is anyone very interested in doing that, or?
Well, maybe just
yes,
one
please.
quick,
We'll just run 2-3 minutes over the time, so I apologize for that. Tereza.
Which I forgot to mention also, President Yoon, President-elect Yoon said that he would send an envoy to Europe and to the United States, but as far as I know, he said that he wouldn't send one to China. So this is also going to be quite interesting how this is going to play out, because this is always like the first diplomatic step that he's going to make. And yes, question of Russia, that's going to be one of the first big challenges he will have to tackle. So let's see.
Well, thank you for addressing that as well. So I think it is time for us to wrap up here. It is just 1 minute over the hour. So I want to again thank you, all four of you, for taking the time and bringing your contributions. And I trust that this is just going to be one of the many conversations we can have on this. And I'm really happy and grateful that we could really connect Taiwan and Korea and in the Indo-Pacific with Europe. And I think this is actually what should be something that we look at in the future as well. Always looking at the bigger context, given the the challenges we face also in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific. So on that note, thank you again for your time. Thank you also for those who supported us in making this event happen at NextGen, at 9-9, and at the Freie University of Berlin. I look forward to staying in touch, and I wish you all a pleasant rest of your day or your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.